The man strapped to the gurney looked like he'd crawled out of a war zone, massive and scarred, reeking of diesel fuel and gunpowder residue. The doctors dismissed him as another violent drifter wasting precious ER space. They wanted him gone, sedated and dumped on the street to clear the bed for a VIP patient who'd chipped a fingernail at an exclusive fundraiser. But when a medical assistant tried to insert an IV line, the vagrant moved with lethal precision, nearly shattering the man's forearm in a combat lock. The entire emergency department went into crisis mode. Armed security formed a perimeter. Everyone was convinced they were dealing with a dangerous lunatic. Everyone except one nurse. She didn't see a homeless troublemaker. She saw a warrior stranded in hostile territory. She stepped directly into the danger zone, leaned close to his ear, and whispered 5 words that changed everything. 5 words that revealed this man wasn't some random drifter. He was a ghost from the most classified operations in military history, and the physician who ordered him thrown out. He was about to discover that some secrets refuse to stay buried. Rain hammered against the windows of St. Jude's Medical Center like artillery fire, relentless sheets of gray that turned Seattle's midnight streets into rivers. It was 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, the cursed hour when trauma nurses braced for the inevitable flood of bar fights, car wrecks, and catastrophically poor life choices wheeled through the ambulance bay. Caterina Segrest tucked a loose strand of dark hair back into her tight bun, her neck muscles protesting after 11 consecutive hours on her feet. She was 28, lean and compact with the kind of quiet intensity that came from growing up in a military household where weakness meant punishment. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she updated patient charts, though her steel-gray eyes constantly scanned the controlled chaos of the emergency room. In hospitals like this, nurses were the foundation that kept everything standing, but doctors like Brock Sterling got all the accolades, the corner offices, and the obscene paychecks. "Segrest, clear out bed 4 immediately," Sterling commanded, his voice cutting through the ambient noise as he strode down the corridor with the self-assured swagger of someone who'd never been told no. He was in his early 50s, impeccably groomed with silver-threaded hair and the kind of sharp jawline that probably got him through medical school as much as his grades. His white coat was pristine, his Italian leather shoes reflecting the harsh fluorescent lighting. "We have an emergency incoming. Senator Whitmore's chief of staff. Severe migraine. He needs immediate attention in a private bay." Caterina didn't pause in her documentation. "A migraine doctor? We've got a multi-trauma case from a motorcycle accident arriving in 8 minutes. We need trauma bays available, not occupied by headaches that belong in urgent care." Sterling stopped mid-stride, turning to fix her with a look that could freeze nitrogen. The diamond-studded watch on his wrist, easily worth more than Caterina's annual salary, caught the light as he crossed his arms. "Senator Whitmore personally funded our new surgical wing, Nurse Segrest. When his people need care, they receive priority care. The transient in bed 4 has been here for 40 minutes, and he's clearly intoxicated. Discharge him. Now. I don't want a VIP smelling whatever biological disaster is happening over there." He pivoted sharply and disappeared toward the ambulance entrance, already rehearsing his most obsequious bedside manner for the political donor. Caterina's jaw tightened, but she swallowed the words burning in her throat. This was Sterling's world. Money talked. Everyone else could die quietly in the waiting room. She moved toward bed 4, where the privacy curtains were half drawn like a tattered flag of surrender. The man occupying the hospital bed wasn't just large. He was monumental. Even lying down, Gerald Middleton dominated the space with the physical presence of a mountain that had somehow learned to breathe. His muscular frame was draped in torn, mud-caked camouflage pants and fingerless tactical gloves that had seen serious use. His olive-drab shirt was shredded across the torso, revealing a blood-soaked field dressing someone had applied with military efficiency. His face was hidden beneath a wild beard streaked with gray, but the scars visible on his exposed skin told stories Caterina recognized all too well. She'd grown up around men like this. Her father had been special forces, the kind who came home with haunted eyes and classified memories he could never share. She knew what a warrior looked like when the war refused to let him go. Pulling on fresh gloves, she gently reached for his wrist to manually check his pulse. The machine readings seemed erratic, possibly from movement or poor sensor contact. His eyes detonated open. They weren't the cloudy, unfocused eyes of someone drunk or drugged. They were Arctic blue, laser-focused, and horrifyingly aware. His hand struck like a viper, his massive fingers encircling her wrist in a grip that could crush bone but stopped just short of causing pain. It was a restraint, a boundary, a warning delivered with surgical control. "No needles," he growled, his voice like gravel dragged across concrete. "You don't put me under. Nobody puts me under." Caterina didn't flinch, didn't try to pull away. She met his stare with the same unflinching calm her father had taught her when facing down aggressors. "I'm not sedating you, sir. My name is Caterina. You're in a hospital in Seattle. You're injured, but you're safe here." His eyes swept the room in methodical patterns. Exits first, then ventilation shafts, windows, potential weapons, blind spots. He was running a tactical assessment, clearing sectors like he was back in some foreign hellhole expecting enemy contact. This wasn't paranoia. This was muscle memory burned in by decades of survival. "Let go," he rasped, releasing her wrist but keeping his hand hovering in a defensive position. "I shouldn't be here. This is wrong. You have a fever pushing 103 degrees, Caterina said evenly, checking the vital signs monitor. "Your heart rhythm is irregular. You're staying until I'm convinced you won't drop dead the second you walk out that door." "I said I'm leaving." "I heard what you said," Caterina interrupted, her voice firm but carrying an undertone of genuine concern rather than authority. "But my shift doesn't end for another hour, and on my watch, nobody dies from pride or stubbornness. Now let me check that dressing on your ribs before you bleed through it." The man studied her with the intensity of someone trained to read threats and allies in microseconds. Something in her posture, her tone, or maybe the absence of fear in her eyes made him relent. Slowly, like a wild animal deciding whether to trust, he allowed her to roll up the sleeve of his tactical jacket. Caterina's breath caught in her throat. His forearm was a canvas of violence. Burned scars from explosions, circular divots from shrapnel, and a long, ragged line that could only be from a blade that had nearly severed the limb entirely. But what froze her completely wasn't the damage. It was the tattoo. Faded almost to invisibility beneath layers of dirt and scar tissue was a symbol she hadn't seen in 15 years. A black spear, crossed by a lightning bolt, stark and simple, with no text or unit designation. It wasn't Army Rangers. It wasn't Navy SEALs. It wasn't any insignia that officially existed. She'd seen it exactly once before, in a locked footlocker in her father's closet. A box he'd told her never to open, never to speak about, never to acknowledge existed. "Who are you?" she whispered, the professional mask slipping for just a second. The man pulled his arm back with surprising speed, yanking the sleeve down to cover the mark. His expression went cold, distant, locked behind walls of classified clearance and plausible deniability. "Nobody," he said quietly. "Just a ghost that should have stayed dead." 23 minutes later, the emergency room exploded into chaos. The VIP had arrived. Chief of Staff Marcus Whitmore swept through the entrance, surrounded by an entourage of assistants, lawyers, and his trophy wife who wept theatrically about his unbearable suffering. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo that probably cost more than most people's cars, one hand pressed to his temple in what he clearly believed was Oscar-worthy agony. Dr. Sterling materialized like a genie summoned by money, his voice dripping with practiced sympathy as he barked orders. "Get him into trauma 1 immediately. I want heated blankets, aromatherapy diffusers, and silence. Absolute silence. Where's the bed I specifically ordered cleared?" He marched directly to bed 4 and ripped the curtain aside with theatrical fury. "Why is this derelict still occupying my trauma bay?" Sterling's voice rose to a near shriek, his face flushing crimson. "I gave you a direct order, Nurse Segrest. Are you incapable of following basic instructions? The stranger sat up slowly, his movements economical and controlled. He didn't acknowledge Sterling's presence so much as calculate the threat level and file it under minimal. He's a patient, doctor, Caterina said, positioning herself physically between Sterling and the bed. He's tachycardic, showing signs of infection, and potentially hypothermic. We cannot legally discharge him in this condition. Watch me, Sterling sneered, his arrogance finally boiling over into action. He reached past Caterina, grabbing for Gerald's shoulder to physically drag him from the bed. Listen, buddy, the free ride is over. You want a bed? There's a shelter 6 blocks south. This is a medical facility for actual patients, not a vagrant hotel. It happened faster than human reaction time should allow. Gerald's left hand swept Sterling's arm aside with contemptuous ease, while his right hand caught the doctor's expensive lapel, twisting the fabric into a handle. Using Sterling's own aggressive momentum against him, Gerald shoved hard, sending the doctor stumbling backward. Sterling's designer shoes found no traction on the polished floor. He crashed into a stainless steel instrument tray, sending surgical tools clattering across the tile in a metallic avalanche. The entire ER went silent. Even the machines seemed to pause. My God, Whitmore gasped from Trauma 1. That maniac just assaulted a physician. Sterling scrambled upright, his face now purple with humiliation and rage, his perfectly styled hair disheveled for probably the first time in his adult life. Security. I want armed security in here right now. This man assaulted me. I'm pressing charges for battery. 2 hospital security guards, Rick and Tony, came running from their station near the intake desk. They were decent guys, trained to handle drunk college kids and confused dementia patients. Not whatever this was turning into. Sir, you need to lie back down and put your hands where we can see them, Rick commanded, his hand dropping to the taser on his belt. Gerald stood. The movement was deliberate, measured, and absolutely terrifying. He rose to his full height, favoring his injured left side but maintaining perfect balance. His hands came up in an open-palm defensive stance that anyone with martial training would recognize as the precursor to extreme violence. Don't touch me, Gerald warned, his voice dropping to a frequency that seemed to vibrate in the chest cavity. I don't want to hurt anyone here. Don't make me. Tase him, Sterling screamed, pointing with a trembling finger. He's dangerous. He's going to kill someone. Tony fired his taser. The probes shot across the 6 feet, separating them, trailing their thin wires like electric spider silk. Gerald didn't dodge. He anticipated. The movement was so fluid it seemed choreographed, a sidestep that put him exactly where the probes weren't. In a single, continuous motion, he closed the distance, his hand flashing out to apply a precise pressure lock to Rick's extended wrist. Rick's hand opened involuntarily, the taser clattering to the floor. Gerald used the momentum to guide Rick backward into Tony, tangling them together in a heap without causing any actual injury. It was surgical, professional, absolutely masterful in its restraint. Lockdown, someone screamed over the intercom. Code Gray, violent patient in Trauma 4. Gerald backed into the corner of the room, his breathing heavy but controlled. He wasn't attacking anymore. He'd achieved a defensive position and was holding it. But a cornered predator is the most dangerous creature alive, and everyone in that room knew it. His eyes locked onto a pair of trauma shears sitting on the supply counter. His hand drifted toward them. Call the police. Sterling was practically hysterical now, hiding behind the nurse's station like it was a bunker. Get SWAT. Get someone who can handle this psychopath. Caterina saw it then, the shift in Gerald's eyes. He wasn't in Seattle anymore. The fluorescent lights became searchlights. The shouting became enemy fire. The encroaching security became hostile combatants. He was back in whatever classified nightmare had put those scars on his body and that symbol on his arm. He was going to fight his way out. People were going to die. Or he was. Caterina knew she had exactly one chance. Ignoring Sterling's screamed warnings to stay back, she walked directly toward the cornered operative. Her steps were measured, non-threatening, but unwavering. "Caterina, don't!" Tony yelled from the floor. "He'll kill you!" She stopped, 3 feet away from him. Gerald's massive chest was heaving, his pupils dilated, his hand inches from the shears. He looked at her, but he was seeing ghosts, seeing enemies, seeing 1,000 firefights that had never really ended. "Sir," she said softly. He didn't respond, didn't even register her presence. Caterina took a deep breath. She thought of the symbol on his arm, the same symbol her father had carried to his grave, along with secrets he'd never been allowed to share and benefits he'd never been allowed to claim. She leaned in close, cupped her hand around his ear, and whispered 5 words that her father had made her memorize when she was 13 years old, words he'd said might save her life one day if she ever met someone from the old unit. "The shadow passes, but the mountain remains." Gerald Middleton froze. The rage drained from his face. His hand fell away from the shears. His eyes cleared, focusing on her with sudden, sharp recognition. His lips moved, forming the second half of the authentication phrase. "And the mountain remembers." The room held its breath. "Behind them, Doctor." Sterling stared in absolute shock, his smartphone hanging forgotten in his hand, as the dangerous vagrant he'd tried to throw into the street transformed before his eyes into something else entirely, something the hospital and Sterling himself was completely unprepared for. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. The authentication phrase hung in the air between them like a ceasefire agreement written in invisible ink. Gerald's entire body remained rigid, but something fundamental had shifted. The predator looking for exits had become a soldier recognizing Allied forces in enemy territory. "How do you know that phrase?" His voice was barely audible, stripped of the aggressive edge that had dominated moments before. "That code was burned 20 years ago. Everyone who knew it is supposed to be dead or disappeared." Caterina kept her voice low, aware that every pair of eyes in the ER was locked on them. "My father was Master Sergeant David Segrest. He served with a unit that officially never existed. He died 3 years ago, and the VA told me his service record listed him as a mess specialist, a cook, but I knew what he really was." Recognition flashed across Gerald's scarred features, followed immediately by something that looked like pain. "Davy Segrest, Mountain Company. He saved my life in Kandahar when an IED turned our transport into scrap metal." His jaw tightened. They listed him as a cook, with no combat designation, no hazard pay, no benefits for his family. "My mother died before him, medical bills we couldn't afford. I've been working double shifts for 6 years, trying to dig out from under the debt." The bitterness in her voice was acidic. "They erased him like he never served at all." "They did that to all of us," Gerald said quietly. "Scrubbed the records, changed our MOSs to support staff, plausible deniability for operations that went off book." His hand moved unconsciously to cover the tattoo on his arm. The black spear was our real unit patch, the one we could never wear on our uniforms. "Behind them, Doctor." Sterling had recovered enough of his composure to resume shouting. "Someone explain to me why this violent criminal is having a pleasant conversation with my nurse instead of being in handcuffs." His voice cracked slightly, the veneer of control fracturing. "Rick, Tony, get off the floor and restrain that man." The security guards were struggling to their feet, Rick nursing his wrist and Tony looking distinctly less enthusiastic about engaging with someone who dismantled them both without breaking a sweat. Caterina turned, positioning herself between Gerald and the advancing security. "Dr. Sterling, I need you to listen very carefully. This patient is not who you think he is." "I know exactly who he is," Sterling spat. "He's a homeless drunk who just committed felony assault on hospital property. And you, Nurse Segrest, are suspended effective immediately for insubordination and—" "He's military," Caterina interrupted, her voice cutting through Sterling's tirade like a scalpel. "Special operations, the kind that doesn't appear on standard records. And if you try to have him arrested or removed from this hospital, you're going to trigger protocols you don't understand and can't control." Sterling laughed, a harsh bark of disbelief. Military? Look at him. He's covered in filth. He reeks of alcohol. And he'd just assaulted 2 security guards and a senior physician. If he was ever in the military, they clearly discharged him for being psychotic. Gerald's eyes narrowed dangerously, but he remained silent, letting Caterina speak for him. There was a tactical intelligence in that choice, a recognition that her voice carried more weight in this environment than his ever would. Check his vitals again, Caterina said, moving to the monitor beside the bed. His heart rate is elevated, but it's not erratic from intoxication. It's tachycardia from an infection or possible cardiac event. His fever is 103.4 degrees. He's not drunk, doctor. He's sick, potentially critically sick. And you tried to throw him out without even running basic blood work. Sterling's face flushed darker. His breath smelled like a distillery. Acetone breath from ketoacidosis, Caterina countered. Possibly diabetic. Or from severe dehydration and metabolic stress. But you were too busy clearing space for a campaign donor's migraine to do your job. The Chief of Staff, Marcus Whitmore, had emerged from Trauma Bay 1, his unbearable migraine apparently not severe enough to prevent him from rubbernecking the drama. Doctor, Sterling, what exactly is happening here? I was promised immediate, discreet care, and instead I'm witnessing what appears to be a hostage situation. Everything is under control, Mr. Whitmore, Sterling said through gritted teeth. Just a minor disruption with an unstable patient. We're handling it. Doesn't look handled to me, Whitmore observed coolly. Looks like your security team just got dismantled by a man you claimed was a harmless vagrant. Gerald shifted slightly on the bed, and every person in the room tensed. But he wasn't reaching for weapons or preparing to attack. His hand moved to the torn fabric of his tactical shirt, pressing against the field, dressing over his ribs. When he pulled his hand away, his fingerless gloves were stained fresh with blood. I'm bleeding again, he said to Caterina, his voice matter-of-fact despite the obvious pain. The wound reopened when I moved. Probably need sutures. Caterina immediately switched into nurse mode, pulling on fresh gloves and carefully peeling back the soaked dressing. The injury beneath was a ragged laceration across his lower ribcage, deep enough to require serious attention but clean enough to suggest it had been treated in the field with military efficiency. This needs more than sutures. You might have internal damage. We need imaging, blood work, and no sedation, Gerald said firmly. No anesthesia. I stay conscious for everything. You can't undergo serious treatment without pain management. Yes, I can. His tone left no room for negotiation. I've had field surgery with nothing but a belt to bite. I can handle whatever you need to do, but I don't go under. Not in a civilian hospital. Not where I can't control the variables. Caterina understood the subtext immediately. He'd been trained to resist interrogation, to maintain operational security, even under duress. Surrendering consciousness meant surrendering control, and for someone who'd lived in the shadows of classified operations, that was a vulnerability he couldn't afford. All right, she agreed. Local anesthetic only. You'll feel pressure but not pain. But you need to let me treat this properly, or infection will do what enemy combatants couldn't. A ghost of a smile crossed Gerald's face. You sound just like your father. He always said I was too stubborn to die properly. Dr. Sterling had apparently reached his breaking point. This is absolutely unacceptable. I am the Chief of Emergency Medicine, and I am ordering this patient removed from my department immediately. Rick, call the police. Real police, not campus security. I want this man arrested. And the doors to the ER burst open with enough force to make everyone jump. 4 men in dark suits strode in with the kind of purposeful movement that screamed federal authority. They weren't hospital security. They weren't local cops. They moved like a tactical unit, their eyes scanning the room with professional assessment before locking onto Gerald. The lead agent, a woman in her 40s with sharp features and graying hair pulled into a severe bun, flashed credentials that made Sterling go pale. Special Agent Victoria Reeves, Department of Defense Criminal Investigation Division. We received an automated alert from this location. Where is the individual designated Echo 5 whiskey? Every head turned toward bed 4. Gerald raised one hand slightly, a casual gesture that somehow conveyed both acknowledgement and wariness. Here, I'm Echo 5 whiskey. But I didn't send any alert. Agent Reeves's eyes dropped to the battered smartwatch on Gerald's wrist, the one Caterina had noticed earlier beneath the grime and blood. Your beacon activated 17 minutes ago. Dead man's switch triggered by authentication protocol. When did you speak the code phrase? Caterina's breath caught. The code, I whispered. It triggered a distress signal. Not distress, Reeves corrected. Location confirmation. When certain authentication phrases from classified operations are spoken aloud, embedded technology sends an automatic ping to relevant oversight agencies. It's a safeguard to prevent unauthorized use of compromised protocols. Her gaze shifted to Caterina with laser focus. Who are you, and how do you have access to Mountain Company recognition codes? My father was Master Sergeant David Segrest, ma'am. He served in Mountain Company before the unit was officially dissolved. He taught me the phrase when I was 13 years old, said it might save my life someday if I met the right person. Reeves's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Davy Segrest. I processed his termination paperwork when Mountain Company was restructured. Good man. Didn't deserve what happened to his records. She turned back to Gerald. Mr. Middleton, you've been off-grid for 6 months. Your last known location was Tacoma. What are you doing in a Seattle emergency room bleeding and triggering authentication codes? Long story, Gerald said, wincing as Caterina continued working on his wound. Short version. I was tracking something that didn't want to be found. Situation went south. Ended up here. Dr. Sterling, who had been uncharacteristically silent during this exchange, finally found his voice. Excuse me, but this is still my emergency room, and I don't care what agency you claim to represent. This man assaulted hospital staff, and I'm filing charges. Agent Reeves turned to look at him with the kind of expression normally reserved for particularly stupid insects. You are Dr. Brock Sterling, Chief of Emergency Medicine at St. Jude's Medical Center. Yes, and I demand to know what authority you think you have to. We've been investigating financial irregularities at this facility for the past 8 months, Dr. Sterling. Specifically, discrepancies in how federal grants designated for veteran care have been allocated. Reeves pulled a tablet from her jacket and tapped the screen. Mr. Middleton's presence here is actually quite fortunate timing. You see, he's a veteran who should have been eligible for full coverage under multiple federal programs. How are you planning to bill his treatment? Sterling's face went from red to ashen in seconds. We would have processed him as uninsured. Standard charity care protocols, even though federal databases would have flagged him as a combat veteran entitled to comprehensive benefits. We don't always have access to complete military records. Because they've been deliberately scrubbed, Caterina interjected, her voice tight with anger. Just like my father's were, listed as support staff instead of operators, denied benefits they earned with blood. Reeves nodded grimly. Which brings us to an interesting question, Doctor. Your hospital has received over $40 million in federal funding over the past 5 years, specifically earmarked for veteran care initiatives. Yet our audit shows that less than 15% of those funds actually reached programs serving veterans. Where did the rest go? The color drained completely from Sterling's face. Behind him, Marcus Whitmore had gone very still, his political instincts clearly screaming at him to distance himself from whatever was about to unfold. I want my lawyer, Sterling said quietly. That's probably wise, Reeves agreed. She gestured to 2 of her agents. Doctor, Brock Sterling, you're being detained for questioning regarding fraud, embezzlement of federal funds, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. You have the right to remain silent. The rest of the Miranda warning faded into background noise as Sterling was efficiently cuffed and led toward the exit. His expensive shoes dragged slightly on the polished floor. All his arrogance evaporated in the face of federal charges that could end his career and his freedom. Caterina finished securing the fresh dressing on Gerald's wound, her hands steady despite the adrenaline still flooding her system. "You knew," she said softly, looking at Gerald. "You knew this was going to happen when I spoke that code." "I suspected," Gerald admitted. "The watch has protocols I don't fully control. Once certain triggers activate, the machine takes over. I wasn't sure if anyone was still monitoring the old frequencies, but I figured if they were, it might get interesting." "Interesting," Caterina repeated, a slightly hysterical laugh bubbling up. "You just triggered a federal raid on my hospital because I whispered 5 words. 5 words that proved you were Davy's daughter," Gerald said, his scarred face softening slightly. 5 words that told me I could trust you, and 5 words that might finally get some justice for the people who were erased from the record books. Agent Reeves approached the bed, her tactical team having secured Sterling and begun processing the scene. "Mr. Middleton, you need proper medical treatment. We can transport you to a military facility." "No," Gerald said firmly. "I stay here, with her." He nodded toward Caterina. "Davy's daughter finishes what she started. I trust her more than I trust any government facility right now." Reeves looked like she wanted to argue, then thought better of it. "All right, but we're posting agents outside this room, and you're officially in protective custody until we sort out what you were tracking and why you ended up bleeding in a civilian ER." "Fair enough," Gerald agreed. As the federal agents dispersed to secure the area and interview witnesses, the ER slowly returned to its normal, controlled chaos. Other patients were being transferred to different bays, staff were being questioned, and Marcus Whitmore had vanished entirely, probably already on the phone with his lawyers and publicist. Caterina sank into the chair beside Gerald's bed, suddenly exhausted. "My father never told me the whole truth about what he did, where he served, who he served with. He said it was safer for me not to know." "He was protecting you," Gerald said. "The less you knew, the less you could be held accountable for. But he also gave you the tools to recognize one of us if you ever needed to." That phrase was our core authentication. It meant you were seeing the real war, not the sanitized version they feed the public. "The shadow passes, but the mountain remains," Caterina recited softly. "What does it mean?" "That empires rise and fall, politicians come and go, but the warriors who stand watch in the dark remain constant. We're the mountain, immovable, unchanging, and we remember everything the shadows try to forget." Caterina felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. "They stole his legacy, turned him into a ghost. And now I find out the same thing happened to you, to all of you." "Not anymore," Gerald said with quiet intensity. "That Agent Reeves, she's not just investigating the hospital. She's part of something bigger, an effort to restore the records, to acknowledge what was done and who did it. Your father's name will be cleared. His service will be recognized. You'll get the benefits that were denied." "I don't want money," Caterina said fiercely. "I want his name. I want the truth on his headstone instead of the lie they carved into it." "You'll get that too," Gerald promised. "I'll make sure of it. The mountain remembers, Caterina, and the mountain keeps its promises." Outside the window, the rain continued to fall on Seattle, washing away the old lies one drop at a time, making space for something closer to truth. And in bed, 4 of Street, Jude's emergency room, a nurse and a soldier sat in the wreckage of secrets too long buried, finally seeing each other clearly in the harsh fluorescent light. The moment of peace lasted exactly 47 seconds. Gerald's face suddenly contorted, his right hand clutching at his chest with enough force that Caterina heard the fabric of his tactical shirt tear further. His breathing became rapid and shallow, his skin taking on a grayish pallor that every trauma nurse recognized instantly. "Gerald?" Caterina was on her feet immediately, reaching for the blood pressure cuff. "Talk to me. What are you feeling?" "Chest," he managed, his voice strained. "Tight, like someone standing on my sternum. Left arms numb." His eyes met hers with grim understanding. "This is bad." The cardiac monitor erupted into a symphony of alarms. Caterina's eyes snapped to the screen, and her blood turned to ice. Ventricular tachycardia. His heart was beating so fast it couldn't pump blood effectively. They had maybe 2 minutes before it deteriorated into full cardiac arrest. "Code blue. Bed 4. Caterina shouted, slamming her hand on the emergency response button. "I need a crash cart now." Agent Reeves rushed back into the room, her hand instinctively moving to her weapon before she processed the medical emergency unfolding. "What's happening?" "Massive cardiac event," Caterina said, already pulling emergency medications from the supply cabinet with practiced efficiency. "His heart's failing. Everyone who's not medical personnel needs to clear this room immediately." Nurses and a resident physician came running, wheeling the crash cart, but the resident took one look at Gerald's vital signs and froze. Dr. Sterling was the attending physician. "He's been arrested. I'm not authorized to." "I don't care about authorization," Caterina snapped. "This man is dying. We're treating him. The liability issues will be my problem, not yours. Get the defibrillator charged to 200 joules and prep the amiodarone. Move." Gerald's back arched suddenly, his entire body going rigid as the ventricular tachycardia transitioned into something worse. The monitor emitted a single, continuous tone that every medical professional dreads: ventricular fibrillation. His heart was no longer beating, it was quivering uselessly, unable to pump blood to his brain or vital organs. "He's in V-fib," one of the nurses called out unnecessarily. Caterina didn't hesitate. She positioned herself at Gerald's side, laced her fingers together, and began chest compressions with the full weight of her body behind each thrust. The force required to effectively compress an adult male chest was immense, especially one as muscular as Gerald's. She could feel his ribs flexing beneath her palms, the sickening give of tissue and bone that meant she was doing it right. "Come on, Mountain," she muttered between compressions, sweat already beading on her forehead. "You don't get to die in a hospital bed, not after everything you survived." "That's not how this ends." The resident finally shook off his paralysis. "Amiodarone is ready. Defibrillator charged. Hold compressions," one of the senior nurses said. "Clear." Caterina stepped back. The nurse placed the paddles on Gerald's chest and delivered the shock. His body convulsed, lifting slightly off the mattress before settling back down. Everyone's eyes went to the monitor. Still flatline. "Resume compressions," Caterina ordered, immediately returning to her position. The rhythm had to be perfect, 2 inches deep, at least 100 compressions per minute, allowing full recoil between each one. Her shoulders burned. Her lower back screamed in protest. She ignored everything except the count in her head and the man dying beneath her hands. "Push the amiodarone," she said, "and get me an EPI syringe ready." "Nurse Segrest, you're not authorized to give those orders." "Then find me someone who is." Caterina didn't break rhythm, or get out of my way and let me save his life. The resident, perhaps recognizing that arguing with a woman performing perfect CPR while simultaneously running a code was a losing battle, began administering the medications. Amiodarone in, charging to 300 joules. 2 minutes of compressions. Caterina's arms felt like lead, but she didn't slow down. Couldn't slow down. Gerald's life depended on the mechanical precision of her movements, on the oxygen she was forcing into his brain with each compression, on her refusal to accept that the mountain could fall. Clear. Another shock. Another convulsion. Another desperate glance at the monitor. Nothing. Still flatline. God damn it! Caterina resumed compressions with renewed fury, as if she could will his heart back into rhythm through sheer force of determination. "You don't get to quit, Gerald. You hear me? Your job isn't finished. My father's name isn't cleared yet. You promised. Nurse Segrest, we need to consider—" "We're not calling it." Caterina's voice cracked. "Not yet. Not while there's still a chance." Agent Reeves stepped closer to the bed, her professional detachment cracking slightly. "How long has he been down?" 4 minutes, one of the nurses reported quietly. "Brain damage becomes likely after—" "I know the statistics," Caterina cut her off. Charge to 360. Maximum output. The resident hesitated. That could cause permanent cardiac damage. He's already dead if we don't get his heart started, Caterina said flatly. Nothing to lose. Do it. The defibrillator whined as it charged to maximum capacity. Caterina performed 30 more compressions, each one a prayer disguised as medical intervention, then stepped back. Clear. The shock was powerful enough that Gerald's entire body lifted off the bed. The smell of ozone filled the air. For a moment, the world held its breath. The monitor beeped. Once, then again, then settled into an irregular but present rhythm. "We have sinus rhythm," the nurse announced, unable to hide the relief in her voice. "Weak, but present. Blood pressure 80/50 and climbing." Caterina sagged against the bed rail, her arms trembling from exertion and adrenaline crash. "Get him stabilized. I want continuous cardiac monitoring, blood work every 2 hours, and keep the crash cart in this room. If he so much as skips a beat, I want to know immediately." Gerald's eyes flickered open, unfocused and confused. His lips moved soundlessly. Caterina leaned close. "Don't try to talk. You just had a massive heart attack. You coded for 4.5 minutes. Your heart stopped, and we had to shock you back. Did I die?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Technically, yes. 3 times. But I didn't let you stay dead." Caterina managed a shaky smile. "Turns out I'm just as stubborn as you are." "Davy's daughter," Gerald murmured, his eyes drifting closed again. "Knew you would be." Within the hour, the entire dynamic of Street Jude's emergency room had shifted again. More federal agents arrived, followed by military personnel in dress uniforms that carried enough brass and ribbons to indicate very serious rank. They didn't ask permission. They simply assumed control, transforming the ER into something that looked more like a command center than a civilian medical facility. The man leading them was introduced as General Marcus Garrett, a 3-star with a face carved from granite and eyes that had seen every ugly thing the world had to offer and refused to look away. He walked directly to Gerald's bed, examined the monitors with a practiced eye, then turned to Caterina. "You're the nurse who saved his life." It wasn't a question, but Caterina nodded anyway. "Caterina Segrest, sir." Something shifted in Garrett's expression. "David Segrest's daughter." "Yes, sir. Did you know my father? I commanded Mountain Company for the last 3 years of its official existence," Garrett said quietly. "Your father was one of the finest soldiers I ever had the privilege to serve with. His death was a loss to this nation, though the nation will never know what it lost." Caterina felt the familiar sting of tears but forced them back. "They erased him, sir, listed him as a cook, denied my family everything he earned." "I know," Garrett said, and the anger in those 2 words was volcanic. "I've spent the past 5 years trying to fix what was done to Mountain Company personnel. The record scrubbing, the benefit denials, the systematic erasure of some of our most valuable operators. I've been building a case, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to force accountability." He gestured to the federal agents and military personnel securing the area. "Mr. Middleton's beacon activation gave us that moment. When he triggered the authentication protocol, it flagged multiple systems. We now have legal justification to audit every facility that received veteran care funding, to investigate every denial of benefits, to reconstruct the true service records of every operator who was deliberately hidden." "Sterling was stealing from veterans," Caterina said. Agent Reeves mentioned an investigation. "Dr. Brock Sterling is one of 47 medical administrators we've been monitoring," Garrett confirmed. "He's not even the worst offender, just the most convenient to arrest first. But his case will be the one that breaks the dam. Once we prove systematic fraud at this level, every other domino falls." Caterina looked at Gerald, still unconscious but stable. "Why was he here? In Seattle?" "He told Agent Reeves he was tracking something." Garrett's expression softened slightly. "He was tracking you, Nurse Segrest." The words hit her like a physical blow. "What? Why would he?" "Because 3 months ago, I asked him to, Garrett said. Your father's case was one of the most egregious examples of record manipulation. His benefits should have been substantial, full medical coverage for dependents, housing allowance, education benefits, pension. Everything was denied based on falsified service records. I needed someone I trusted to verify that David Segrest's family had been properly compensated. Gerald volunteered. Caterina's mind raced. He came here to find me, to check on my father's benefits, and discovered they'd been systematically denied and buried under administrative red tape designed to discourage appeals, Garrett said grimly. He reported back to me 2 weeks ago with evidence of deliberate obstruction. We were building the case when he went dark. I assume that's when he discovered something that connected the benefit denials to the hospital fraud. Sterling, Caterina breathed. He's on the VA review board. He would have had access to veteran benefit applications, authority to flag cases for additional scrutiny, and the power to ensure certain applications never got approved, Garrett finished. We've already seized his financial records. The man owns property in 3 states, drives a car worth more than most people's houses, and lives a lifestyle that doesn't match his hospital salary. Every denied veteran benefit meant more money stayed in the federal allocation pool, which Sterling then embezzled through fraudulent hospital programs. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Caterina felt sick. How many veterans were denied because of him? In this region alone, preliminary estimates suggest over 300 cases of suspicious denials in the past decade. Nationwide, if this pattern holds across other administrators we're investigating, we're looking at thousands. And the families, Caterina said softly. The spouses and children who struggled, who went into debt, who didn't get the support they'd earned, because men like Sterling wanted a bigger house. Yes, Garrett agreed. Which is why I'm going to make absolutely certain that Brock Sterling becomes the example that ensures this never happens again. Over the next 2 days, St. Jude's Medical Center became the epicenter of a scandal that would ultimately reshape veteran care administration across the country. Federal agents executed search warrants, seized servers, and interviewed hundreds of staff members. The hospital's financial records were dissected line by line, revealing a web of fraudulent programs, shell organizations, and embezzled funds that made Sterling's initial arrest look like a minor traffic violation. Gerald remained in the ICU, his heart slowly recovering from the massive insult it had suffered. Caterina stayed with him whenever she wasn't working her regular shifts, which had been reduced after hospital administration realized that the nurse who'd saved a federal witness's life and exposed their chief physician's crimes probably shouldn't be pushed too hard. On the 3rd day, Gerald was finally conscious and stable enough for real conversation. Caterina found him sitting up in bed, looking uncomfortable in a hospital gown and surrounded by enough monitoring equipment to track a small satellite. You look terrible, she said, pulling up a chair. You should see the other guy, Gerald replied, his voice still rough but stronger. Oh wait, he's in federal custody facing 23 counts of fraud and embezzlement. I win. You died 3 times and call that winning? I'm still breathing, aren't I? That's winning by my standards. He studied her face. Garrett told you why I was in Seattle. He did. You came to check on me, to make sure my father's benefits were being processed, and found out they'd been deliberately buried, Gerald said, his jaw tightening. Every appeal denied on technicalities. Every request for review lost in administrative limbo. Your father served for 17 years in operations that don't officially exist, and they tried to pretend he spent his career flipping burgers in a mess hall. Why did you care? Caterina asked quietly. You didn't know me. You barely knew my father toward the end of your service together. Why track me down? Why risk your life investigating benefit fraud? Gerald was silent for a long moment. Your father saved my life in Kandahar. The IED that hit our convoy turned 3 vehicles into scrap metal. I was trapped in the wreckage, bleeding out, with hostile forces closing in. Davy pulled me out under fire, carried me 2 clicks to the extraction point, and held pressure on my wounds the entire way. I wouldn't be here without him. He met her eyes. When I got out, when they scrubbed my records and denied my benefits, I was angry. But I was single, no dependents, and I'd learned to live off-grid. I could survive the betrayal. But when Garrett told me they'd done the same thing to Davy, who had a family, who had a daughter who deserved better, I couldn't let that stand. The mountain remembers, Caterina, and debts get paid. You nearly died paying this one, she pointed out. But I didn't. And now Sterling's going to prison, the records are being corrected, and your father's legacy is being restored. I'd call that a successful operation. General Garrett chose that moment to enter, carrying a folder thick with documents. Mr. Middleton, you should still be resting. Sleeping is boring, sir. I've done enough of it for one lifetime. Garrett allowed himself a slight smile before turning to Caterina. Miss Segrest, I have news regarding your father's service record. As of this morning, the Department of Defense has officially corrected Master Sergeant David Segrest's military occupational specialty from mess specialist to special operations, classified designation. All benefits commensurate with his true rank and service record have been approved and will be dispersed retroactively. Caterina's hands began to shake. Retroactively? For how long? From the date of his retirement until the present, Garrett said gently, including medical benefits that would have covered your mother's treatments, housing allowances, pension payments, and education benefits. The total amount, including interest and compensation for documented hardship, is substantial, enough to clear any debts and provide long-term financial security. She couldn't speak, couldn't process what he was saying. For 6 years she'd worked herself to exhaustion, drowning in medical debt and funeral costs, believing her father had been nothing more than a forgotten cook in an army that didn't care. And now, in the space of 72 hours, everything had changed. There's more, Garrett continued. Your father's burial site at Evergreen Memorial will be updated with full military honors. A formal ceremony will be held to recognize his service, and his headstone will reflect his true rank and commendations. He'll be remembered as the soldier he was, not the lie they tried to make him. The tears finally came, hot and unstoppable. Caterina didn't try to hide them. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank Mr. Middleton, Garrett said. He's the one who refused to let this injustice stand. 3 weeks later, on a crisp autumn morning, with clouds breaking to reveal patches of crystalline blue sky, Caterina stood in Evergreen Memorial Cemetery surrounded by more military personnel than she'd ever seen in one place. General Garrett had arranged everything, transforming what should have been a quiet grave update into a full honors ceremony. Her father's new headstone was draped with an American flag. Around it stood members of Mountain Company, the ones who'd survived and could attend. They wore dress uniforms heavy with ribbons and medals, their faces weathered and hard, but their eyes reflecting genuine respect for a fallen brother. Gerald stood beside Caterina, still moving carefully after his cardiac event but refusing to miss this moment. He'd been discharged from the hospital 5 days earlier with strict orders to rest, which he'd promptly ignored in favor of helping Caterina arrange the ceremony. The chaplain spoke words about sacrifice and service. A rifle detail fired a 21-gun salute that echoed across the cemetery like thunder. 2 soldiers folded the flag with precise, reverent movements and presented it to Caterina with a salute that she returned awkwardly, unpracticed but sincere. When the formal ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, Gerald placed a hand on her shoulder. He'd be proud of you, of everything you've become. I wish he could have seen this, Caterina said, staring at the new headstone that finally told the truth. Wish he could have known that someone remembered, that someone cared enough to fight for him. He knows, Gerald said quietly. The mountain remembers, and now the world remembers too. 6 months after that day in Evergreen Memorial, Caterina stood in front of a renovated warehouse in South Seattle, watching workers hang a sign above the entrance. The building had been a condemned industrial space 3 months ago. Now it gleamed with fresh paint and purpose, transformed by the veteran benefits money she'd received and the substantial donation from an anonymous benefactor she strongly suspected was General Garrett. The sign read, Mountain House, Veterans Support Center. Inside, The facility offered everything Caterina had wished existed when her father was alive: medical care, mental health counseling, job training, housing assistance, legal support for navigating the labyrinth of VA benefits, and most importantly, a place where veterans could gather without judgment, where their service would be recognized regardless of what their official records said. Gerald appeared beside her, looking healthier than he had in months. His cardiac rehab was progressing well, and he'd grudgingly admitted that maybe regular medical care wasn't the worst thing in the world. "Looks good," he said, nodding at the sign. "Your father would approve." "It's not just for him," Caterina said. "It's for all of them. Every operator who got erased, every soldier whose records were scrubbed, every family that was denied what they earned. This is their mountain. It doesn't pass. It doesn't fade. It stays. The shadow passes, but the mountain remains," Gerald quoted softly. "And the mountain remembers," Caterina finished. Behind them, the first veterans were arriving for the grand opening. Some came in wheelchairs, some walked with canes, some carried invisible wounds that showed only in the careful way they scanned for exits and avoided sudden movements. But they all came, drawn by word of mouth through the veteran community that there was a new place, a safe place, run by people who understood. Dr. Brock Sterling, meanwhile, was beginning year 3 of a 15-year federal sentence. His conviction had triggered a cascade of investigations that ultimately resulted in the arrest of 41 other administrators, the recovery of over $400 million in embezzled funds, and the correction of more than 8,000 veteran service records across the country. General Garrett had been promoted to 4 stars and given oversight of a new Veterans Affairs Integrity Division specifically created to prevent future fraud. Agent Reeves headed the investigative team that was still unraveling the full scope of the corruption, and in Seattle, at a veteran support center named for a company that officially never existed, a nurse and a soldier stood watch. The shadows had tried to make them disappear, tried to erase their stories and deny their sacrifices. But mountains don't disappear. They endure. They stand firm against time and tide and all the forces that try to grind them down to nothing. And this mountain, built on truth and sacrifice, and the refusal to let injustice stand, would remain long after the shadows finally passed.